The town of Willow Creek was small and quiet, sitting between dusty hills and wide golden fields. The air always smelled of dry earth, pinewood smoke, and horses. People knew each other's names, their secrets, and their stories, or at least they thought they did. And at the far edge of town, up on a hill where the wind sang through the grass, lived Eleanor Hayes, the widow everyone whispered about. Eleanor was not old, though sorrow had added years to her eyes. Her husband, George Hayes, had passed away 2 years earlier after a long sickness. Since then, Eleanor had managed their land on her own, one of the richest and most beautiful pieces of property in the whole valley. It had a clean spring, soft green pastures, and tall oak trees that shaded the horses in summer. But people in Willow Creek did not like a woman being too strong, too independent, or too sure of herself. A widow with land and money was seen as both a mystery and a temptation. When George was alive, the Hayes Ranch had supplied milk, hay, and meat to half the town. The sheriff and the banker had often come to drink tea on the porch and talk business with him. After he passed away, those same men began to visit less often, unless they had papers for Eleanor to sign. Eleanor refused to sell, no matter how many times the banker smiled or how often the local land baron, Mr. Clayton Reeves, sent offers through his men. Reeves owned almost every acre west of the creek, and he wanted the Hayes land badly. It was the only property blocking him from joining his ranch to the river. Eleanor's refusal made her a target. At first, it started with gossip. A few women from church whispered that George's death had been too sudden. They said she had mixed something into his tea. There was no proof, only the emptiness of small-town boredom mixed with jealousy. Then came the missing cattle. One night, Reeves claimed that 10 of his finest steers had gone missing, and someone had cut the fence near the Hayes property. No one had seen anything, but it didn't matter. The sheriff didn't bother to investigate properly. Instead, he rode to Eleanor's house, hat in hand but eyes cold, and said, "Folks are saying things. Mrs. Hayes, it might be best if you moved on." Eleanor stood on her porch that day, sunlight falling across her face. She was dressed in plain brown, her hair tied neatly. "This land is mine," she said quietly. "It was my husband's, and it's all I have left of him." The sheriff gave a small, false smile. Sometimes holding on too tight causes trouble. From that day on, Eleanor knew she was being watched. When she went to town to buy supplies, people stopped talking as she entered the store. The blacksmith looked away. The preacher's wife gave a stiff nod but refused to meet her eyes. Only old Joe, her ranch hand, remained loyal. He was a thin, wiry man with a gray beard and a limp, but his loyalty ran deep. He had worked for the Hayes family since George's father was alive. "They're stirring up trouble, ma'am," Joe told her one evening as they mended the fence together. The sky was painted orange and gold, and the sound of crickets filled the fields. "Reeves wants your land, and he's got the sheriff in his pocket. Don't matter what's true. They'll make people believe what they want." Eleanor sighed. "Then I'll just have to make them remember who I am." She kept working, morning till night, her hands blistered and back aching. She milked cows, fixed fences, and cooked her own meals. She refused to leave the ranch even when she heard rumors that Reeves had been buying up the land around her, closing her in like a trap. A few weeks later, a letter came. It was stamped with Reeves's seal and delivered by one of his men. It offered her a final price for the property, far below its worth. The letter ended with a line that made her blood run cold. "If you do not accept, other arrangements will be made." Eleanor tore up the letter and burned it in her stove. The next morning, she found her barn doors wide open. The horses were gone. The tracks led toward the creek, where the mud was thick and hard to follow. Joe searched all day, but there was no sign of them. That evening, the sheriff arrived again, this time with 3 men from town. "Seems Reeves lost more cattle last night," he said, his tone almost casual. "Funny thing, the tracks lead near your property again." Eleanor stood tall. "You know I didn't take anything. My horses were stolen too." The sheriff shrugged. "That's so? Well, people are worried. They're saying maybe you're cursed, Mrs. Hayes. Maybe all this bad luck is following you for a reason." She bit her tongue to keep from crying out. "You know me," she whispered. "You knew George. We helped this town for years." But the sheriff turned away. Sometimes folks change. After they left, Eleanor sat on her porch, her eyes on the dark fields. The moonlight made everything look silver and still, but inside her heart was heavy with fear. She had no family nearby, no one to defend her name. The people who once called her friend now looked at her like a stranger. She thought often of Thomas Reed, the man she had loved before George. They had been young then, full of dreams. Thomas had gone off to serve in the army and promised to return. But the letters stopped coming after the 3rd year, and she had believed him lost to war or time. When George asked for her hand, she had accepted, telling herself it was the sensible thing to do. Now, as she sat in silence, she wondered what had become of Thomas. Did he ever think of her? Did he know she was still alive and alone? Days turned into weeks, and the tension in Willow Creek grew. Reeves's men began to ride past her property more often. The townsfolk avoided her completely. At the general store, the owner refused her credit, saying, "I can't risk my business on bad talk, Mrs. Hayes." One afternoon, as Eleanor was fetching water from the well, she saw smoke in the distance. Thick black smoke rising from Reeves's fields. Someone had set his barn on fire. Within an hour, riders came galloping up her hill. The sheriff was at the front, his face red with anger. "Eleanor Hayes," he shouted, "you're under suspicion for arson and theft." She dropped the bucket in shock. "You can't be serious." He dismounted, eyes hard. "You've been trouble long enough. The town's decided we'll settle this in the morning. Don't run or it'll be worse for you." And with that he rode away, leaving her standing in the dust, the sound of hooves echoing across the hills. That night, old Joe came to her door, breathing hard. "Ma'am," he said, "they ain't waiting for no trial. They're talking about taking you at sunrise. A hanging peg without the law." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, the room spun. Then she steadied herself and nodded. "Thank you, Joe, you should go. They'll come for you too if they think you helped me." He hesitated. "I ain't leaving you." "Yes, you are," she said softly. "You've done enough." When he finally rode off into the night, Eleanor sat at her small wooden table and lit a candle. She took out paper and ink and began to write. "My dear Thomas, I don't know if you're still alive or if these words will ever find you. I am afraid tonight. The town I once called home has turned against me. If you remember me at all, remember that I never did wrong. Whatever happens tomorrow, I hope the truth reaches someone who still believes in it." She folded the letter, sealed it with wax, and placed it inside her locket, the same one Thomas had given her years ago before he left. Outside, the wind howled through the trees. The stars blinked coldly above the dark fields. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote cried, lonely and sharp. Eleanor stood at her window, looking out over the land that had cost her everything. She whispered, "If this is my end, I'll face it with my head held high." And as the first light of dawn began to touch the hills, she saw riders approaching through the mist, and knew that her time had come. The morning came soft and golden, but for Eleanor Hayes the light brought no warmth. The sound of horses echoed through the hills, and the dust they kicked up hung in the air like smoke. She stood by the window, calm on the outside but trembling deep within. She knew what they had come to do. The riders stopped at her gate. There were 5 of them. The sheriff, 2 deputies, and a pair of men she didn't recognize, probably hired hands of Clayton Reeves. They tied their horses and walked toward the house, their shadows long and thin across the dry earth. The sheriff called out, "Mrs. Hayes, step outside. We need a word." Eleanor opened the door slowly. She was dressed neatly, her hair pinned back, her voice steady though her heart was beating fast. "You already had your word yesterday, Sheriff," she said quietly. "You told me the town wanted me gone." The sheriff took off his hat, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and put it back on. "It's not just talk anymore," he said. "Last night Mr. Reeves lost another barn. He says he saw someone riding near your land. Says it looked a lot like your ranch hand." Eleanor frowned. "Old Joe was with me. He left just before dawn. Can anyone else say the same?" the sheriff asked, his voice sharp. "No," she replied. The sheriff sighed as if he were tired. "Then it's your word against his. You'll need to come into town while we sort this out." Eleanor knew what that meant. There would be no fair trial, no honest hearing. Reeves controlled the bank, the cattle market, and even the preacher's good opinion. Once she was in town, she would never leave freely again. She looked at the sheriff for a long time before speaking. "If you're taking me, at least let me lock up my house." He nodded. "Make it quick." Eleanor stepped inside, pretending to tie her shawl tighter, but instead she reached for her locket on the table. She slipped it into her pocket. Then she whispered a small prayer, not for her safety but for truth to find its way through all the lies. When she stepped outside, she saw Reeves himself waiting by his horse. His coat was clean, his boots polished, and his expression calm in a way that chilled her. He smiled slightly when he saw her. "Good morning, Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice smooth as oil. "I'm truly sorry about all this. It's such a shame when fine people fall under suspicion." "You mean when fine people refuse to sell their land?" Eleanor answered. He chuckled softly. Now, let's not be bitter. You'll have a chance to explain yourself. Though between us, I'd recommend making peace while you still can. Land is only land, after all." Eleanor looked straight into his eyes. "And some men are only thieves." His smile faded, but he said nothing more. The sheriff gave a nod, and they rode into town with Eleanor in the middle of the group, her wrist loosely tied with a rope. Willow Creek looked the same as it always did. White church steeple, dusty main road, the sound of a hammer from the blacksmith shop. Yet something in the air had changed. Windows closed as she passed. People stepped aside and whispered. A woman at the bakery door muttered, "That's her, the one who burned Reeves's barn." Another added, "I heard she put a curse on her husband." Eleanor kept her head high, but every word stung like a thorn. When they reached the sheriff's office, Reeves dismounted and whispered something to him. The sheriff nodded. "All right, boys," he said loudly. "We'll keep her here till the preacher arrives. Folks need to see justice done." He didn't say trial. He said justice, and that word in a town ruled by fear meant something else entirely. They locked Eleanor in a small wooden cell behind the office. The air was warm and smelled of dust and iron. Through the bars, she could see the church tower. The bell hung silent now, but she knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. By noon, the town square was crowded. People came not because they cared about right or wrong, but because they were curious. It had been a long time since anything exciting happened in Willow Creek. Some came with anger, others with guilt, and a few with pity they were too afraid to show. Inside her cell, Eleanor prayed softly. She didn't pray for a miracle. She had learned long ago that miracles rarely visited people like her. She prayed for courage instead, and for someone somewhere to remember her side of the story. At that moment, a small face appeared near the bars. It was Annie Carter, the baker's young daughter. She couldn't have been older than 10. "Mrs. Hayes," the little girl whispered, "Mama says you're bad, but I don't believe it. You gave me candy last Christmas." Eleanor smiled weakly. "Thank you, dear. Always believe what your heart tells you, not what others say." Before Annie could answer, her mother pulled her away sharply. "Don't talk to her," she hissed. The girl looked back once, her eyes full of confusion. That small kindness and a child's trust was enough to keep Eleanor's spirit from breaking. As the sun began to set, the church bell finally rang. The sound rolled across the town, heavy and slow like a warning. People began gathering in front of the sheriff's office again. The preacher, Reverend Moore, walked with a Bible in hand, his white collar shining in the evening light. He stopped by Reeves and the sheriff, speaking in a low voice. "Are you certain this is the right path?" he asked. "God's word speaks of justice, but also of mercy." Reeves smiled. "Then may God have mercy on her soul, Reverend. The town has already chosen justice." The preacher hesitated but said nothing more. Eleanor was brought out, her hands free now, but surrounded by men with rifles. The crowd murmured, a mix of anger and excitement. Some spat on the ground. Others just watched silently. Reverend Moore read from his Bible about sin and redemption, though even he looked uneasy. When he finished, Reeves stepped forward, his voice loud and clear. "This woman," he said, pointing at Eleanor, "has brought trouble to our town. She's cursed our land, stolen our peace, and destroyed honest men's work. I've lost property because of her wickedness, and others have suffered too. The law must stand for what's right." The crowd cheered, though a few faces looked uncertain. Eleanor took a deep breath. "You say I'm wicked," she said, her voice steady. "You say I brought trouble here. But look around you, who truly feeds the fire? I worked my land, fed your families, and asked for nothing but peace. And now you stand here, ready to hang an innocent woman for your greed." The sheriff frowned. "That's enough," he said. "No," Eleanor said louder now. "You may take my land. You may take my life, but you can't take the truth. It will find you even if I'm gone." The crowd fell silent for a moment. Even Reeves looked uneasy, but pride wouldn't let him show it. The preacher finally raised his hand. "Enough for today," he said softly. "Let her stay the night. We'll decide at sunrise. The people began to leave, their excitement fading to murmurs. Some looked back at Eleanor, unsure now of what they believed. As she was led back to her cell, the sheriff leaned closer and whispered, "You should have sold the land when you had the chance." That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. The moonlight came through the window, pale and cold. She thought of George, her late husband, and the kindness in his eyes before sickness took him. She thought of Thomas Reed, the man she once loved and lost to time. She remembered the last letter he sent years ago, promising to return once he'd earned his place in the world. She had believed him gone forever, but somewhere far away across the miles of plains and rivers, a rider was moving toward Willow Creek, unaware that the woman he once loved was fighting for her life. Eleanor closed her eyes and whispered, "If you're still out there, Thomas, please come home." Outside, the night grew still. The church bell stood silent again, waiting for dawn, and with it a judgment that could change everything. The night in Willow Creek was quieter than usual. The stars hung low and bright, watching over the little town as if they knew what was coming. A thin wind moved through the empty streets, carrying the faint sound of the church bell that had rung earlier. Inside the sheriff's small jailhouse, Eleanor Hayes sat alone, waiting for dawn. The room was dim, lit only by a lantern hanging near the door. The wall smelled of old wood and dust. A blanket was folded neatly on the cot beside her, but she hadn't touched it. Her hands rested in her lap, still and calm, though her heart was heavy. She had stopped crying hours ago. Outside, she could hear the distant sound of voices, men talking in low tones near the saloon, women whispering as they hurried home. The town was asleep, but not peacefully. Everyone knew what sunrise would bring. Eleanor closed her eyes and breathed deeply. She tried to remember better days, the sound of laughter in the house when George was alive, the smell of fresh bread baking in the oven, the sound of the wind moving gently through the oak trees near the spring. She thought of how simple life had been before greed poisoned everything. She also thought of Thomas Reed, the man who had once promised her forever. She had been 20 then, and he 24, strong, kind, full of dreams. He had worked as a deputy under her father before joining the army. They had planned to marry in the spring, but war had changed everything. His letters had stopped coming after a few years, and her hope had faded. She had waited, but time had taught her how to live without waiting. Now, sitting in that cold cell, she wondered if he was still alive somewhere, if he ever thought of her when he looked at the stars. The sheriff's office door creaked open, breaking her thoughts. It was old Joe, her loyal ranch hand. His face looked tired, his clothes covered in dust. He slipped inside quietly, carrying a small bundle. "Ma'am," he whispered, "I couldn't just leave. Brought you some bread and water. Ain't much, but it's something." Eleanor smiled weakly. "You shouldn't be here, Joe. If they find you—" "They won't," he said, cutting her off. "They're all busy at the saloon, bragging about how they'll keep order come morning. Makes me sick, it does. You ain't done nothing wrong?" "Thank you," she said softly, "for believing me." Joe's eyes glistened. "I know the truth. Reeves has been paying them off. He wants your land more than anything. He's been setting you up for months." Eleanor sighed. "I know, Joe, but it's too late now." He shook his head. "Don't you say that. I sent word down the road. There's a marshal riding this way, and name's Reed. Maybe he can do something." Eleanor froze. Her breath caught in her throat. "Reed," she repeated. "Thomas Reed?" Joe blinked in surprise. "You know him?" Her voice trembled just a little. "Once, a long time ago." Joe nodded slowly. "Then maybe the good Lord's working after all. Word is he's been tracking a man for forgery, and that man happens to be one of Reeves's buyers. If he gets here before dawn, maybe we got a chance." Eleanor closed her eyes, hope flickering faintly in her chest. "Thank you, Joe. You've done more for me than anyone else ever could." He placed the bundle on the floor near the bars. "You hang on, ma'am. Don't you give up yet." With that, he slipped back into the night, leaving Eleanor alone again. She sat quietly for a long while, her thoughts spinning. Could it really be him, Thomas, after all these years? She remembered his steady blue eyes, the way he used to smile at her like she was the only person in the world. She remembered how safe she'd felt with him, even when life was uncertain. But she quickly shook the thought away. People change. Years change them even more. Maybe he wasn't the same man. Maybe he wouldn't even remember her. Still, as the night deepened, She found herself whispering his name like a prayer. Far away, beyond the dusty hills and moonlit plains, a lone rider was making his way west. His horse, a tall chestnut mare, moved steadily despite the long miles. The man on her back wore a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat. A faint silver badge glimmered beneath the folds of his vest. The badge of a U.S. Marshal. It was Thomas Reed. The years had changed him, his face older, marked by the weight of things seen and done. His eyes, once bright with youth, now carried the calm sadness of a man who had lived through too many storms. Yet beneath it all there was still the same fire, the same sense of right and wrong that had driven him since his early days. He had left the army after the war and joined the Marshal Service. For years he had chased outlaws, thieves, and men who hid their crimes behind money. One of those men, a land swindler named Henry Cobb, had been arrested 2 weeks earlier in Kansas. Before being taken away, Cobb had confessed that he worked for someone big, a man named Clayton Reeves in a town called Willow Creek. That name had struck Thomas like lightning. Willow Creek. It had been years since he'd heard it. The place where he'd left his heart, and the woman he'd never stopped thinking about. He didn't know what had become of Eleanor. He had written to her once after the war, but the letter came back unopened. He assumed she had moved on, maybe married someone kind and gentle the way she deserved. Now, as he rode under the silver moonlight, he wondered if she was still there. He had no idea that she was sitting in a cold jail cell waiting for sunrise and an unfair end. The road was rough, but Thomas didn't slow down. He pushed his horse harder, driven by a feeling he couldn't explain, a strange pull in his heart that told him he was needed. He reached a small creek at midnight, stopped to let his horse drink, and looked up at the sky. The stars were bright, and one seemed to shimmer more than the others. He smiled faintly. "Still guiding me, Ellie?" he whispered. Back in Willow Creek, the hours crept by slowly. Eleanor could hear the clock in the sheriff's office ticking, each second a reminder that time was running out. She thought about writing another letter, but she had no paper left, so instead she spoke softly to the silence. "If you ever come back, Thomas," she whispered, "I want you to know I never forgot you, even when I tried to, even when life went on without you." Tears filled her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. She didn't want fear to be her last companion. Outside, the wind rose and rattled the shutters. The moon slipped behind a cloud, covering the town in darkness. Somewhere, a dog barked. Then everything went still again. Eleanor lay down on the small cot, finally letting her tired body rest. Her mind drifted between dreams and memories, the scent of wildflowers in spring, the sound of Thomas laughing by the river, the way her husband George had once held her hand and said, "You've got the strongest heart I've ever known." When she woke, faint light was touching the window, the first pale gray of dawn. She sat up slowly, her heart heavy but calm. She knew what the morning meant. She brushed her hair back, straightened her dress, and stood tall. She wanted to face whatever came next with dignity, not fear. Outside, a rooster crowed. In the distance, she could hear the sound of horses, faint but growing louder. She didn't know it yet, but one of those horses was carrying Thomas Reed, racing against time and fate. And as the first rays of sunlight touched the streets of Willow Creek, both their paths, one of despair, one of hope, were about to meet again. The sun rose slowly over Willow Creek, painting the sky with soft shades of gold and pink. The town, still half asleep, began to stir with quiet excitement. Doors creaked open. Boots echoed on the wooden sidewalks. People came out to watch what they thought would be a morning of justice. Near the church stood a large oak tree, old and strong, its branches stretching wide like arms over the square. Beneath it, men were tying a thick rope. The sound of the rope brushing against the wood made a low, dry hiss that sent a chill through the air. Eleanor Hayes was led out of the jailhouse, just as the morning light touched the steeple. She walked calmly, her hands bound loosely in front of her. Her face was pale but peaceful, her chin lifted high. There was no anger in her eyes, only quiet sorrow and courage. The sheriff walked beside her, not looking at her. Reeves followed behind, wearing a dark coat and a satisfied smile. The crowd gathered close, whispering and pointing, their voices rising and falling like waves. She doesn't look scared. Maybe she knows something. Maybe she really did it. Eleanor heard every word but kept walking. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She thought of old Joe, hoping he had escaped safely. She thought of Thomas, whether he was truly on his way, or if it had only been a dream born from hope. The preacher, Reverend Moore, stood near the oak tree with his Bible in hand. His face looked tired, his eyes filled with worry. He stepped forward and spoke softly to her. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, "I asked them to wait, but they would not listen. I'm sorry. I will pray for your soul." Eleanor looked at him kindly. "Pray for theirs too," she said gently. "They need it more than I do." The sheriff cleared his throat and raised his hand. "Quiet down," he shouted. The murmurs faded. "We're gathered here for the good of Willow Creek. This woman stands accused of theft, arson, and deceit. She's had every chance to confess, and she's refused. Justice must be done." From the edge of the crowd, Reeves stepped forward, his voice loud and smooth. "This town was built on honesty," he said. "And no one, no matter how high or low, should be above the law. We must protect our homes and our future." The crowd nodded, some muttering words of agreement. But a few faces in the back looked unsure. They didn't know what to believe anymore. The sheriff motioned to his men. "Bring her forward." Eleanor walked to the tree, her steps steady. The rope swung gently in the breeze. For a moment she looked up at the sky, bright, wide, and endless. It reminded her of the field she used to walk with her husband, of the laughter they once shared. She whispered under her breath, "George, I'm coming home." The sheriff tied the rope loosely around her wrists and spoke quietly. "You've got one last chance to speak." Eleanor turned to the crowd. Her voice was clear and calm. "You call this justice," she said. "But it's not. It's greed wearing a mask of law. I've done nothing but work this land and care for my home. You say I'm guilty, Mont, but deep down every one of you knows this isn't about truth. It's about taking what isn't yours." The crowd shifted uneasily. Some lowered their eyes. Others whispered among themselves. Reeves frowned. "Enough," he said sharply. "We've heard enough talk. Sheriff, do your duty." The sheriff hesitated. For a brief moment, something human flickered in his eyes. Doubt, guilt, or maybe fear. But before he could act, a loud voice rang through the air. "Hold it right there." The sound echoed across the square, strong and commanding. Heads turned. The crowd parted as a rider galloped into town, his horse kicking up dust and sunlight. The man wore a dark coat and a wide hat, and a silver badge gleamed on his chest. It was Thomas Reed. He pulled his horse to a stop in front of the oak, the animal breathing hard. His face was covered with dust from the road, his eyes sharp and fierce. He looked straight at the sheriff. "Untie that woman now!" the crowd gasped. Reeves stepped forward, his smile fading. "Who do you think you are, interrupting lawful business?" Thomas reached into his coat and pulled out his badge, holding it high for all to see. "U.S. Marshal Thomas Reed," he said. "And from what I've heard, there's nothing lawful about what you're doing here." A hush fell over the square. The sheriff swallowed hard. "Marshal Reed," he said slowly, "this is a town matter. She's been judged by her own people." Thomas dismounted and walked closer, his boots echoing on the boards. "Judged?" he said. "Without a trial? Without evidence? You call that justice?" Reeves stepped forward again. "She burned my barn, stole my cattle, and lied to this whole town. We don't need an outsider telling us how to keep order." Thomas turned to him, eyes cold. "Funny thing," he said. "I've been following a trail for weeks, a man named Henry Cobb. He was arrested in Kansas for forgery and fraud. Before he was taken in, he said he worked for someone big, someone buying land with fake papers. A man named Clayton Reeves." Reeves froze. "That's a lie." Thomas reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a stack of papers, holding them up for everyone to see. "These are copies of land deeds, all signed with your name in Cobb's handwriting. You've been stealing property all across this valley, and now you're trying to cover it up by blaming this woman." The crowd erupted in whispers. Faces turned from Reeves to Eleanor, then back to the sheriff. The preacher stepped forward, looking stunned. "Is this true?" he asked softly. Thomas nodded. "It's all here. I've got federal orders to seize any property tied to Reeves's fraud, and I've got testimony from 2 witnesses who saw his men cut fences on Mrs. Hayes's land to make it look like she was the one stealing cattle." The sheriff's face turned pale. "Reeves, is this true?" Reeves stammered. "You can't prove—" Before he could finish, Thomas handed the papers to the preacher. "Proof enough," he said firmly. "And if you want more, you can read Cobb's signed confession." The crowd began to murmur angrily now, not at Eleanor but at Reeves. The men who had tied the rope around the oak stepped back uncertainly. Reeves looked around, realizing the tide had turned. "You're making a mistake, Marshal," he hissed. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Thomas took a step closer. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with. A man who hides behind money and fear." The sheriff finally found his voice. "Reeves, you're under arrest." Reeves tried to back away, but two deputies grabbed him. He struggled, shouting that it was all lies, but no one believed him anymore. The truth had finally come out. Thomas turned to Eleanor. Her hands were still tied, the rope rough against her skin. He stepped forward and gently untied the knots, his fingers trembling slightly. "You're safe now," he said softly. For a moment, she couldn't speak. The sound of the crowd faded around her. She looked up into his face. Older, rougher, but still the same eyes she remembered. "Thomas," she whispered. "It's really you." He smiled faintly, his voice thick with emotion. "It's me, Ellie. Took me a long time, but I'm here." Tears filled her eyes, but she smiled. The first real smile she'd felt in years. The preacher stepped forward and placed a hand over his heart. "Seems the Lord has sent justice after all," he said quietly. As Reeves was led away in chains and the crowd began to scatter, Thomas stayed beside Eleanor. The morning sun warmed the ground beneath their feet, and the wind carried away the last whispers of anger and doubt. Eleanor looked at the oak tree, the rope still hanging loose from its branch. Then she turned to Thomas. "I thought I'd never see you again." He touched her hand gently. "You almost didn't," he said. "But something kept pulling me here." She smiled again, tears shining in her eyes. "Maybe it was hope. Or maybe it was love," he said softly. The two stood there in silence. The crowd fading into the distance, the golden light wrapping around them like a promise. For the first time in a long time, Willow Creek was quiet, not with fear, but with peace. The sun was high in the sky when the crowd finally began to leave. The dust from their boots lifted into the air, curling in the warm wind and fading like the noise of the morning. The oak tree stood quiet again, its branches swaying gently, the rope now lying forgotten on the ground. Eleanor Hayes stood at the edge of the square, her wrists free, her heart still racing. Everything felt unreal. The faces, the voices, the sudden shift from fear to freedom. She could still feel the roughness of the rope on her skin, and yet the world seemed brighter, almost too bright to believe. Thomas Reed stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on her arm as if he was afraid she might disappear if he let go. His horse waited nearby, calm now after the long, desperate ride. Around them, the townsfolk avoided meeting Eleanor's eyes. The same people who had watched her with suspicion now looked at the ground in silence. Guilt hung in the air heavier than any wind. Reverend Moore stepped forward first. His hat was in his hands, his voice low and full of regret. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, "I have no words strong enough to undo what's been done. I failed to stand for the truth when I should have. Please forgive me." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded softly. "You were afraid," she said. "So was everyone else. But fear is what lets lies grow." The preacher's eyes lowered in shame. A few women from the town, the same ones who once whispered behind her back, came forward with downcast faces. One of them, Mrs. Carter, the baker's wife, spoke first. "I told my little girl to stay away from you," she said. "She cried last night because she said you were kind. I'm sorry for not believing her." Eleanor smiled gently. "Your daughter has a good heart. You should listen to it." The woman nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek. Slowly, one by one, others came forward. The blacksmith, the storekeeper, a few of the men who had tied the rope. They offered quiet apologies, some stammering, some too ashamed to speak at all. Eleanor accepted each one with calm grace, though inside her heart ached. Forgiving was not easy, but holding on to anger felt heavier. She had carried enough weight already. Thomas watched her in silence. He had seen many acts of bravery in his life. Men who stood their ground in battle, women who protected their families, but nothing compared to the quiet strength of Eleanor Hayes standing there, forgiving the very people who had nearly destroyed her. When the last of the townsfolk drifted away, only a few remained, and the sheriff, Reverend Moore, and Thomas. The sheriff looked pale and older than he had that morning. "Marshal Reed," he said quietly. "I didn't know about Reeves's papers. I swear it, but I should have looked closer. I let the man's money talk louder than my duty. Thomas gave a small nod. You did wrong, he said simply. But now you've got a chance to do right. Help clean up this town. Make sure no one ever goes through what she did again. The sheriff nodded, his eyes full of remorse. You have my word. Then he turned to Eleanor. I'll see to it your land is protected, ma'am. Reeves won't ever trouble you again. She looked at him with a tired smile. Thank you, she said softly. I hope you mean it. I do, he answered, and walked away quietly, leaving his hat in his hands. When the square finally emptied, the silence felt strange, almost peaceful. The dust had settled. The morning chaos was gone, replaced by the hum of distant birds and the creak of wooden signs swinging in the breeze. Eleanor turned to Thomas. For a long time, they simply looked at each other, saying nothing. There was too much to say, and yet silence felt like the only language that fit. At last, Thomas spoke. You've always been stronger than anyone I ever knew, he said. She smiled faintly. You've always had good timing. You showed up just in time to save me. He chuckled softly. 15 years late, but I finally made it. Her smile deepened, but her eyes glistened with tears. I thought you were gone, Thomas. After the war, I waited. Then your letters stopped. I thought... She paused, her voice trembling. I thought I lost you forever. Thomas lowered his head. I wrote to you, Ellie, twice. Both letters came back marked unclaimed. I figured you'd moved on. So I buried myself in work, chasing men who did wrong, thinking maybe I could fix the world in pieces. But the truth is, I never stopped thinking about you. Eleanor's heart ached at his words. Life took different turns for both of us, she said quietly. But maybe it brought you back for a reason. Maybe so, he said, his eyes softening. They stood together for a while, watching the clouds drift over the valley. The air smelled of rain and the sunlight fell across the land like a blessing. Thomas finally spoke again. What will you do now? Eleanor looked toward the hill where her ranch stood, the home she had fought so hard to protect. I'll rebuild, she said. Fix the fences. Plant again. Start over, he nodded. You don't have to do it alone this time. Her gaze met his, gentle but steady. You'd stay? He smiled, that old, familiar smile she remembered from long ago. If you'll let me. Eleanor looked out over the open land, the grass swaying softly in the wind. For years she had walked those fields in silence, feeling the emptiness of loss. Now for the first time she felt something different, hope. Then stay, she said. There's room on that hill for two hearts who've waited long enough. A week later, the town of Willow Creek looked different. Reeves had been taken away by federal officers, and word spread quickly that his land schemes had reached across several counties. The sheriff had resigned and been replaced by a young deputy who promised fairness. People began visiting Eleanor again, not out of gossip, but with baskets of bread, tools, and offers to help. Some worked quietly on her fences, others mended her barn. It didn't erase what had happened, but it began to heal it. Eleanor accepted the help with gratitude, though she still preferred to work with her own hands. Each morning she rose before the sun, walked to the field, and felt the earth between her fingers. The land felt alive again, as if it too had been freed from its shadow. Thomas stayed by her side, helping where he could. He was no longer chasing criminals or running from ghosts. He found peace in the simple things, mending a gate, feeding the horses, sitting with Eleanor on the porch as the sun went down. Sometimes they talked about the past. Sometimes they said nothing at all, just listened to the wind and the sound of life returning. One evening, as they sat together watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink, Eleanor spoke softly. You know, I used to hate this tree, she said, nodding toward the old oak near the house. It reminded me of that day. Thomas looked at it and then back at her. It's just a tree, Ellie. What matters is that you're still standing taller than it ever could. She smiled at his words. Maybe so. Maybe it's time to stop remembering pain and start remembering strength. He reached over and gently took her hand. You've always been strong. I'm just lucky to be here to see it. They sat there in silence as the first stars appeared, soft and steady in the darkening sky. The crickets began their evening song, and the air was filled with the gentle hum of life. For the first time in years, Eleanor Hayes felt peace, real peace. Not the quiet of fear, but the calm of freedom. The past still lived in her memory, but it no longer chained her. And as the night settled over Willow Creek, she leaned her head against Thomas's shoulder and whispered, "Maybe the best endings are really just new beginnings." Thomas smiled, his hand closing around hers. "Then let's begin again," he said softly. The stars shone brighter, the wind moved through the grass like a song, and the town that had once nearly destroyed her now lay quiet and humbled beneath the open sky. A place where truth, at last, had taken root. And from the hill where Eleanor and Thomas sat, watching the land they both loved, it seemed as though even the earth itself had forgiven the past.